"Oh, no, certainly not," Dr. Norbury agreed hastily. "However, you shall see the letter presently and judge for yourself. We mustn't introduce irrelevant topics while the experiment is in progress, must we, Doctor?" "You had better wait until we have finished," said Thorndyke, "because I am going to turn out the light. Switch off the current, Polton." The green light vanished from the bulb, the hum of the interrupter swept down an octave or two and died away. Then Thorndyke and Dr. Norbury rose from their chairs and went toward the mummy, which they lifted tenderly while Polton drew from beneath it what presently turned out to be a huge black paper envelope. The single glow lamp was switched off, leaving the room in total darkness, until there burst out suddenly a bright orange-red light immediately above one of the trays. We all gathered round to watch as Polton, the high priest of these mysteries, drew from the black envelope a colossal sheet of bromide paper, laid it carefully in the tray, and proceeded to wet it with a large brush which he had dipped in a pail of water. "I thought you always used plates for this kind of work," said Dr. Norbury. "We do, by preference, but a 6-foot plate would be impossible, so I had a special paper made to the size." There is something singularly fascinating in the appearance of a developing photograph, in the gradual, mysterious emergence of the picture from the blank white surface of plate or paper. But a skiograph or X-ray photograph has a fascination all its own. Unlike the ordinary photograph, which yields a picture of things already seen, it gives a presentment of objects hitherto invisible. And hence, when Polton poured the developer on the already wet paper, we all craned over the tray with the keenest curiosity. The developer was evidently a very slow one. For fully half a minute no change could be seen in the uniform surface. Then, gradually, almost insensibly, the marginal portion began to darken, leaving the outline of the mummy in pale relief. The change, once started, proceeded apace. Darker and darker grew the margin of the paper, until from slaty gray it had turned to black. And still the shape of the mummy, now in strong relief, remained an elongated patch of bald white. But not for long. Presently the white shape began to be tinged with gray, and as the color deepened, there grew out of it a paler form which seemed to steal out of the enshrouding gray like an apparition, spectral, awesome, mysterious. The skeleton was coming into view. "It is rather uncanny," said Dr. Norbury. "I feel as if I were assisting at some unholy rite. Just look at it now." The gray shadow of the cartonnage, the wrappings and the flesh was fading away into the background, and the white skeleton stood out in sharp contrast. And it certainly was rather a weird spectacle. "You'll lose the bones if you develop much farther," said Dr. Norbury. "I must let the bones darken," Thorndyke replied, "in case there are any metallic objects. I have 3 more papers in the envelope." The white shape of the skeleton now began to gray over, and as Dr. Norbury had said, its distinctness became less and yet less. Thorndyke leaned over the tray with his eyes fixed on a point in the middle of the breast, and we all watched him in silence. Suddenly he rose. "Now, Polton," he said sharply, "get the hypo on as quickly as you can." Polton, who had been waiting with his hand on the stopcock of the drain tube, rapidly ran off the developer into the bucket and flooded the paper with the fixing solution. "Now we can look at it at our leisure," said Thorndyke. After waiting a few seconds, he switched on one of the glow lamps, and as the flood of light fell on the photograph, he added, "You see, we haven't quite lost the skeleton." "No." Dr. Norbury put on a pair of spectacles and bent down over the tray, and at this moment I felt Ruth's hand touch my arm, lightly at first, and then with a strong, nervous grasp. And I could feel that her hand was trembling. I looked round at her anxiously and saw that she had turned deathly pale. "Would you rather go out into the gallery?" I asked, for the room with its tightly shut windows was close and hot. "No," she replied quietly. "I will stay here. I am quite well." But still she kept hold of my arm. Thorndyke glanced at her keenly, and then looked away as Dr. Norbury turned to ask him a question. "Why is it, think you, that some of the teeth show so much whiter than the others?" "I think the whiteness of the shadows is due to the presence of metal," Thorndyke replied. "Do you mean that the teeth have metal fillings?" asked Dr. Norbury. "Yes." "Really, this is very interesting. The use of gold stoppings, and artificial teeth, too, by the ancient Egyptians is well known. But we have no examples in this museum. This mummy ought to be unrolled. Do you think all those teeth are filled with the same metal? They are not equally white." "No," replied Thorndyke. "Those teeth that are perfectly white are undoubtedly filled with gold, but that grayish one is probably filled with tin." "Very interesting," said Dr. Norbury. "Very interesting. And what do you make of that faint mark across the chest, near the top of the sternum?" It was Ruth who answered his question. "It is the eye of Osiris," she exclaimed in a hushed voice. "Dear me!" exclaimed Dr. Norbury. "So it is. You are quite right. It is the Achat, the eye of Horus, or Osiris if you prefer to call it so. That, I presume, will be a gilded device on some of the wrappings." "No, I should say it is a tattoo mark. It is too indefinite for a gilded device, and I should say further that the tattooing is done in vermilion, as carbon tattooing would cast no visible shadow." "I think you must be mistaken about that," said Dr. Norbury. "But we shall see, if the director allows us to unroll the mummy. By the way, those little objects in front of the knees are metallic, I suppose?" "Yes, they are metallic. But they are not in front of the knees, they are in the knees. They are pieces of silver wire that have been used to repair fractured kneecaps." "Are you sure of that?" exclaimed Dr. Norbury, peering at the little white marks with ecstasy. "Because if you are, and if these objects are what you say they are, the mummy of Sebek hotep is an absolutely unique specimen." "I am quite certain of it," said Thorndyke. "Then," said Dr. Norbury, "we have made a discovery, thanks to your inquiring spirit. Poor John Bellingham! He little knew what a treasure he was giving us. How I wish he could have known! How I wish he could have been here with us tonight!" He paused once more to gaze in rapture at the photograph, and then Thorndyke, in his quiet, impassive way, said, "John Bellingham is here, Dr. Norbury. This is John Bellingham." Dr. Norbury started back and stared at Thorndyke in speechless amazement. "You don't mean," he exclaimed after a long pause, "that this mummy is the body of John Bellingham?" "I do indeed. There is no doubt of it." "But it is impossible. The mummy was here in the gallery a full 3 weeks before he disappeared." "Not so," said Thorndyke. "John Bellingham was last seen alive by you and Mr. Jellicoe on the 14th of October, more than 3 weeks before the mummy left Queen Square. After that date, he was never seen alive or dead by any person who knew him and could identify him." Dr. Norbury reflected a while in silence. Then, in a faint voice, he asked, "How do you suggest that John Bellingham's body came to be inside that cartonnage?" "I think Mr. Jellicoe is the most likely person to be able to answer that question," Thorndyke replied dryly. There was another interval of silence, and then Dr. Norbury asked suddenly, "But what do you suppose has become of Sebek hotep? The real Sebek hotep, I mean." "I take it," said Thorndyke, "that the remains of Sebek hotep, or at least a portion of them, are at present lying in the Woodford mortuary, awaiting an adjourned inquest." As Thorndyke made this statement, a flash of belated intelligence, mingled with self-contempt, fell on me. Now that the explanation was given, how obvious it was! And yet I, a competent anatomist and physiologist and actually a pupil of Thorndyke's, had mistaken those ancient bones for the remains of a recent body. Dr. Norbury considered the last statement for some time in evident perplexity. "It is all consistent enough, I must admit," said he at length. "And yet, are you quite sure there is no mistake? It seems so incredible." "There is no mistake, I assure you," Thorndyke answered. "To convince you, I will give you the facts in detail. First, as to the teeth. I have seen John Bellingham's dentist and obtained particulars from his casebook. There were in all 5 teeth that had been filled. The right upper wisdom tooth, the molar next to it, and the second lower molar on the right side, all had extensive gold fillings. You can see them all quite plainly in the skiograph. The lower left lateral incisor had a very small gold filling, which you can see as a nearly circular white dot. In addition to these, a filling of tin amalgam had been inserted while the deceased was abroad, in the second left upper bicuspid, the rather gray spot that we have already noticed. These would, by themselves, furnish ample means of identification, but in addition, there is the tattooed device of the eye of Osiris." "Horus," murmured Dr. Norbury. "Horus, then, in the exact locality in which it was borne by the deceased and tattooed, apparently, with the same pigment. There are, further, the suture wires in the kneecaps. Sir Morgan Bennett, having looked up the notes of the operation, informs me that he introduced 3 suture wires into the left patella and 2 into the right, which is what the skiograph shows. Lastly, the deceased had an old Pott's fracture on the left side. It is not very apparent now, but I saw it quite